If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode was Dr. Grace Robinson, and Grace's research looks at the area of drugs. In particular, what Grace focuses on is how young people are used to sell drugs across what's called county lines. That is, taking drugs from one city and moving them into another. This is quite an interesting but also sad and insightful look into how children are often used to be able to carry out these drug deals. And often it shows you how this becomes kind of a way of life for many young people across the country. So I hope you enjoy it. I really did like doing this interview. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for inviting me on first. So my name is Grace Robinson. I completed my PhD in December of last year, and I've since been working at the University of Leeds. I did my undergraduate degree at John Moores University, master's there as well, and then did the PhD in Edge Hill University. Unfortunately, my contract is due to end at the end of August in Leeds, so I'm just looking for some other employment. But recently I've set up a research and consultancy company which specialises in commission research, educational workshops and expert witness testimony as well.
Great. What's that called, Grace?
It's called Black Box Research and Consultancy.
Brilliant. Excellent. So you're from Liverpool originally?
I'm not, no, I'm from Cheshire actually, but I came to Liverpool I think in 2011 for university and I've just never left. Right. It's one of them places that just seems to capture your heart really, and I've made it a base and it feels more like home than when I go back to my parents now, so it's probably where I'll remain or keep as a base I think for the future.
I see. I was going to ask you if you're red or blue, you see, Grace.
I'd have to say red because my partner's a red, so I'd get shot if I said anything else. So, but I'm not massively into football.
Great. And what about sociology? Where did that start for you?
So actually, my background is criminal justice predominantly. So my undergraduate degree was forensic psychology and criminal justice, and then the master's was criminal justice, and the PhD is criminology. Obviously, the research that I've ended up doing, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute, crosses different disciplines and touches quite heavily on sociology. But yeah, my background is mainly criminal justice.
Right. So do you see yourself as a sociologist or a criminologist or a psychologist?
Do you know what? I probably don't. I think more as I'm progressing through academia or as the research that I enjoy, I think probably a little bit more anthropological than anything else. I don't feel like I fit within the criminologist field, which is strange. I don't know, yeah, I think probably anthropological.
Yeah, the reason I ask that, Grace, is I always ask the guests on the show as to who influenced them. I wondered if there was any particular writers or theorists that influenced your work.
Yeah, there are. So the academic that sticks out the most for me, and I've always been really interested and driven by ethnographies and ethnographic researchers. There's a criminologist called Daniel Briggs. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was based in London and has since moved to Madrid. And he's done quite a few different ethnographies And the one that really inspired me was one that he did in Madrid on heroin using communities. So he was looking at this really marginalised and disenfranchised group of people. He spent considerable amounts of time in this community in Madrid documenting their lives and struggles and the inequalities and really the pain and suffering that these people were undergoing. But the way in which he's got a book called Dead End Lives, and it's just fantastic and really inspired me. And I think someone very similar to his writing style would be Philippe Bourgeois. One of my favourite books is In Search of Respect, Selling Crack in El Barrio. And again, similar sort of way of researching. Again, it was an ethnography. He was looking into Puerto Rican communities in inner city America and documenting the inequalities and the struggles that they were facing and how they were unable to become more involved in mainstream society because of the violent street worlds that they were involved in.
Yeah, any A-level students will be aware of his work. Any A-level students listening will have heard that name, definitely, yeah. So that's
fantastic.
Yeah, so that kind of leads us into your own research then, that follows a similar kind of path?
So my research is into gangs, child criminal exploitation and county lines. That was PhD research, and it was sort of an extension from master's research in which I was looking into the possession of firearms amongst street gangs in Merseyside. So the PhD was based in Merseyside as well. And I was speaking to practitioners, people who worked in the Matrix Gun and Gang Unit and people from youth offending teams. And this is going back to about 2015. And they were basically growing concerned about the number of young people that were being brought into the criminal justice system for possession with intent to supply, firearms offences, knife offences, but more worryingly, they were being picked up in areas like Scotland, Wales, Devon, Cumbria, Cheshire, really far away from Merseyside. And the practitioners were discussing the idea of child criminal exploitation. And at the time, I started to do some research about it. There was nothing in the media, there was no government reports, there was no academic literature, there was literally nothing. And if you fast forward to where we are now, obviously county lines and child criminal exploitation, you'd struggle to turn on the news without hearing something about them every day. And county lines has become a national priority on the government agenda. So the PhD research has been really timely, I guess. And I did want to do ethnographic research. I would have loved to. But because of the ethical issues, the amount of violence that the gangs in Merseyside were involved in at the time, there was a shooting every day, it just wouldn't have ever got through ethical clearance. So I sort of used some ethnographic techniques. I was based in a youth offending team in Merseyside and also a few different alternate education providers. I was doing observations, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, things like that. And I ended up speaking to around 26 practitioners and 18 gang-involved young people. And the research, it was really because there was nothing about child criminal exploitation. There was no understanding of it. So the focus was really explaining or exploring child criminal exploitation from a gang context and trying to understand what young people perceived it to be and what practitioners perceived it to be as well.
And so was your research covert in any way then? How are you gathering information?
No, it wasn't, no. Again, just for ethical reasons. But yeah. No, I spent a lot of time, it was quite strange really. At the youth offending team, obviously the young people, they've got to be there through court orders. So naturally, they're a lot less inclined to want to speak to someone like me because of the risks that would have given them. When I actually went to the alternate education providers, it was just a case of going 3 times a week, sitting there with the young people, getting to know them. And then actually I was really lucky because a lot of them just wanted to be a part of the research. They wanted to tell their story. I think it was the only time that they'd been interviewed when it hadn't been in a police station. So they were great. They were really, really open and really honest. So I really enjoyed it actually, and I was lucky.
And let's start right from the beginning, because you mentioned county lines. For those listeners that don't know, could you just define what that term means?
Yeah, of course. So county lines is a form of child criminal exploitation. In its most simplest form, it's the sending of, it's going out of one area to a different area to sell drugs from that area. And the motivation is to increase profit margins and reduce the risk of violence from competitors in that area, and also reduce the risk of detection from law enforcement. What has actually ended up happening is that county lines operators or drug dealers that are high up are sending young people to these different areas to minimise risks to themselves. So they'll end up sending a young person to that different area, and usually it's at least 40 to 50 miles away from their own home. They'll set that young person up in a base that tends to be the home of a vulnerable drug user, and that young person will end up staying in that area for about 2 to 3 weeks, supplying drugs from that area and not returning home until all of those drugs are sold. Wow. It's a really, really clever scheme for drug dealers, because they're away from that criminality. They're bringing back all of the profits, and the young person is taking all the risk with very little return or reward.
And what are we talking in terms of drugs? Heroin, crack cocaine?
Yeah, sorry, class A drugs, so heroin and crack cocaine predominantly. Some young people will have cannabis as well, or cocaine as well, but yeah, it tends to just be heroin and crack cocaine.
And from your research, what sort of ages are we talking about? What age of children are often targeted to carry out these deals?
Around 13 to about 19, but I'd say probably 14, 15-year-olds.
So I was going to say, is the idea that they're using people that are under the age of 18, so not classed as adults, so if they get caught, there's less punishment? Is that the thinking?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of myths that they tell the young people. I think, under the age of 18, you've got very influential young people. I should actually mention that every single one of the young people in my research had been excluded from mainstream school. So you've got a lot of young people who are influential, after respect, after significance. They haven't got the skills that would allow them to succeed in the legitimate job market. And they've got a lot more time on their hands. So there's a lot of young people that want to get involved in drug supply, and they want some money because they're not going to get any money from anywhere else.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually, do they go seeking the work, or are they kind of recruited by someone else?
That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked, because, if you had a look at media reports, they would tell you that every young person is forced, or every young person is coerced and manipulated. To an extent, every young person who was involved in county lines in my research was exploited, but they had a lot more agency than practitioners or journalists give them credit for. Some of the young people did actually ask, they went looking for the opportunity. They asked drug dealers in their area for the opportunity to work the county lines, and they wanted to do that.
Yeah, and I suppose you can see the attraction. You said the rewards are relatively small, but even if you're talking a few £100 to a 13, 14-year-old, that's significant. It
is, and I had one of the young people that I spoke to, he was actually saying, well, I've been excluded from school, I've got a criminal record, I'm making about £300 every 2 days, and where else am I going to get that money from? And the issue is that because they've had some part in drug supply, it's very, very fast money. And once they get used to making £300 every 2 days or £100 a day, they aren't willing, one, they haven't got the skills I've already said, but two, they aren't willing to train and wait for that long-term goal. Yeah. So they just want that money fast.
So once they found a way in, it's very difficult to come out of that.
It is, yeah, completely.
And with most of your sample, I've noticed you've said he quite a lot. Were they predominantly males who got involved in this?
They were, yeah. So 18 young people, they were all male. They were all 14 to 20, and they'd all been excluded from mainstream school. And it's not that young females don't get involved in county lines, because it's becoming a lot more common now when females are exploited in a different way. They're used predominantly to hide drugs, or they're used to go and look at a different area, or actually they're just used by males to decrease the suspicion around, So if a young lad is seen in a different area with a young girl, then it looks a bit more legitimate than a group of lads in a different area. So girls definitely do have a role in county lines, but I never came across any, unfortunately, in Merseyside.
And perhaps a difficult question, with the young children themselves, did they tend to be users?
No, not at all, no. They were all users of cannabis, and it was their cannabis use that was the way into drug supply. Drug dealers in their area would often allow them to build up drug debts for cannabis, and they might say, you know, you can have this free on this occasion, don't worry about it. And then a few weeks later they'd come back and they'd say, you know, where's that money for that cannabis, knowing that that young person couldn't pay them back, and they would then offer them the opportunity to sell drugs on their behalf. So, you know, allowing them to accrue that drug debt. In terms of hard drug use, young people in Merseyside that I spoke to, they've got a real stigma about hard drug use, and they would also always say that they would never touch it. They dehumanised users of hard drugs, even though the drug users were their only customers, and without them they wouldn't be making any money. But, you know, they really saw people who took hard drugs or Class A drugs as weak, as inferior and less than human. And that's how they began to inflict violence on the drug users, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So they just saw it purely as business.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. Do you mind giving us an example of kind of one of the case studies, how it would work for in terms of the business deal, how they conduct it and so on?
Yeah, of course. I actually did an expert witness report a few weeks ago, so I'll tell you the details of that without giving you too much information. But so young person, say for example from Merseyside, gets involved in smoking cannabis with his friends, becomes addicted to cannabis, uses it as a way to sleep or as a way to socialise, and builds up a drug debt. The county lines operator or the drug dealer will offer them the opportunity to sell drugs for them. The county lines operators usually go to the different area themselves and look for a new customer base, look for a new property to supply drugs from, and that is usually the home of a vulnerable drug user. They will then transport that young person to that different area. Now that could be by taxi, it could be them driving them themselves, or the young person could be put on a train. Obviously, due to the pandemic, it's a lot more suspicious now if the young person was on the train, so they tend to be driven down or up wherever they're going. So they'll be taken to this new area, they'll be put into a house, and they'll be basically monitored by this drug dealer until they've sold all of the drugs that they were given.
How do they get paid? Do they get a percentage of the cut, or how are they earning from it?
So they'll be paid in cash. Usually they'll be paid once they get back, or they might be paid half once they get there, and they'll be paid the other half when they come home. Some of the young people said that the drug dealers sometimes came and gave them a new supply of cannabis, or they gave them a little bit of money, expenses to get weed or to get cigarettes or whatever they might want in that area. So they have an expenses of about £10 to £20 a day while they're there. And then once they return home, they'll be paid. It's not great money. I think it's something like £500 every 3 days or £500 for a week. But to a young person, it's a lot of money.
Yeah, I was going to say that's still a significant amount of money for those young people. And then you mentioned the violence aspect of it. How does that come about?
So the young people that are working county lines, they've got a risk of violence every single day from other drug dealers in that area. So, if they go to Wales, for example, from Merseyside, they've got the risk of the local drug users in that area, the Welsh boys. They've also got the risk of other drug dealers or other drug networks from Liverpool, because there's quite a divide in Merseyside. You've got the south of Liverpool and you've got the north of Liverpool, and they tend to have their own disputes between themselves. So violence can play out in a completely different area between different gangs from Merseyside, for example. But then young people can also be victimised by drug users in that area. So, for example, I had a young person that was staying in a drug user's home, and he was supplying this drug user with heroin. It's basically compliance is secured through free drugs. So drug users in the area will usually want to invite these people into the home because they know that they'll be getting free drugs from it. But once the home's pretty much being taken over by these drug dealers or by these young children, they then become discontent with having them in the homes and they'll want them out. But it's become too late because of the violence and the threats to their own safety. But so I had a young person that was threatened by a drug user with a needle who was trying to steal his supply of heroin off him. So young people that are working in those areas have risk of violence from drug dealers and risk of violence from drug users as well. So they're always got to be vigilant and always sort of in fight or flight mode.
Does your research show that they just kind of accept that as part of the job? Do they become desensitized to the violence? Yeah,
it's every day for them. The violence will have started before they've even got to that new county lines area. So the difficulty that I have is that the kids from my research weren't forced, but I also hear through other people that in London it's a completely different context. So in London you've got children that are being forced, that are being sent to a new area, and if they try and decline to work for these drug dealers, then they'll be threatened with extreme violence. For example, they might be kidnapped, they might be stabbed, the house might be targeted. So there's a lot more force and it's a lot more violent in areas like London. But in Merseyside, the young people, they said to me that there was no force. They wanted to work the county lines. It was, for some of them, it was exciting, and for some of them, they enjoyed it. But again, that risk of violence is always present, and they will have been used to that from being involved in youth groups or crime, even before they've got to that different area. So they are used to the violence, and it's normalised.
Thank you, Grace. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, we'll talk about the research in a bit more detail. Welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Grace Robinson. Grace, I wanted to delve a little bit more down into the young people, the county lines workers. What was their relationship like with the drug user once they built up a relationship with who they were serving the drugs to?
This is probably one of the most interesting findings of the research, and it was something that I was not expecting to find. Once the young person had got into this drug user's house and been staying there for quite some time and really taken over the property, actually, and not that it might have been the county lines worker or the young person that's taken over the property, but the drug dealer or the network in general. But the young people began to exploit the drug users in that area. So they would exploit these drug users into engaging in risky behaviours. For example, I had a young person that made a drug user eat the contents of an ashtray. They would film it, they would use it for entertainment purposes, and this drug user would receive a little bit of free heroin in return. Other drug users were used for sexual gratification. There was quite a lot of sexual exploitation that happened as well as criminal exploitation whilst working county lines. If a young person had done a good job, or a young female drug user, so someone very, very vulnerable, was offering sex or their services in return for some free drugs, then sometimes that the young person's boss or the drug dealer would pay a young girl for their sexual services, if that makes sense. Other ways in which drug users were used were to complete drug transactions. So one of the young people said to me, it looks a lot less suspicious if a drug user passes something else to another drug user, rather than me actually going out onto the streets and passing a little bag of crack cocaine or heroin to this drug user. So they were being exploited themselves because they were in different areas and they weren't receiving much money for what they were doing, and there was violence involved, but they actually had a lot more agency and they began exploiting other people and, getting a little bit more power back from their own situation and taking power away from a really subordinate group of people. And the way in which they did that was through a process of moral neutralization. So they completely dehumanized drug users. They called them crackheads, they called them fiends. They were really, really repulsed by drug users, hard drug users, even though they were their customers, and they saw them as less than human. And because of that, they were able to laugh at them, they mocked them, they were violent to them, and they sexually exploited them sometimes as well.
Wow, that's really extreme. And in some cases, they may have even seen the person pass away, I guess.
Yeah, actually, yes, I should mention that. Yeah, some of the young people said to me that they'd witnessed overdoses, drug overdoses. You know, these are 14, 15-year-old children who were dealing with quite traumatic situations. Yeah, drug overdoses. I mean, one young person said to me that there's someone just died in front of them, and they carried them upstairs and put them on the bed and approached another drug user in that area to ring the police.
Wow. And so I suppose it's another element of that dehumanizing that it became just part of the job.
Yeah, it really didn't. I mean, they said they were scared, but it wouldn't be a scared that you or I had. You know, if someone did that in front of me, I wouldn't have a clue what to do. I'd really panic, and it really, really would hit me hard. But they just had this ability to move on from it, or it didn't really seem like a big deal. It was just part of the job.
And that's quite interesting that they were open with you, that they were exploiting the drug user.
I don't think they saw it as that.
Really?
They really didn't. They just saw it as they were getting a laugh at somebody else's expense, or they were minimising the risks to themselves by sending another drug user out to sell drugs for them. I mean, I know that they knew that they were harming somebody else, but I don't think they understood the terminology of exploitation, and I don't even think that they saw that they were being exploited themselves. And that's one of the issues you've got with sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation, is that the victim really doesn't identify with the fact that they are a victim.
Mm. And what about, maybe we could change it up to the relationship between the County Lines young person and the employer. What did your research show about the relationship between those?
So the relationships varied quite significantly. So as I said at the very start, I had 18 young people. Only a handful of those young people had got experience of working county lines. The other young people were exploited into criminality in their own area. And these two groups of people were quite different characteristically. So the county lines workers, they were a lot more mature. They were very charismatic. You know, they had a lot more resilience. They could handle themselves on the streets. Whereas the young people that were exploited in their own area tended to be, there was a lot more force involved in that. They tended to be very immature, influential, and they weren't respected enough. And respect is key in county lines. They weren't respected enough to be sent to work the county lines because they weren't trusted, or they weren't competent drug dealers. You know, the drug dealers or the county lines operatives could see that they were going to have a lot of risk attached to them.
Yeah, you expected to be quite savvy, quite street smart to be able to work for.
Yeah. So yeah, the relationships between the county lines workers and their bosses, so to speak, varied quite a lot. So some young people had quite good relationships. Some young people were sent in a tent or in a sleeping bag and really didn't have a very good relationship. And again, I'll come back to that element of respect and capital, really, so social capital. So young people that were respected, they were given a better deal, if you will. They were put up in somebody's house, and they were treated a lot better as well. And the young people that weren't very respected, those are the ones that were subject to a lot more violence and a lot more manipulation. For example, one of the young people in my research that was engaged in county lines, he said that his relationship was more like a graftership. So this idea of grafting, drug dealing, it wasn't a relationship, but it was a graftership, and it was sort of contractual. And they had quite a good relationship because that respect was mutual as well. Because if the young person doesn't respect the person that they're working for, and I had one young person who was like that, they're more inclined to try and steal some of that drugs or steal some of the profit and maybe run away with it. And if the drug dealer doesn't respect that young person, then they really won't feel like that young person is competent enough to get the job done and bring the profit home.
So I'm guessing there was some kind of illegitimate opportunity structure or hierarchy that the young person could work their way up.
I think that's the idea that surrounds it, and I think a lot of young people feel like they might reach that end goal, but really it's changed a lot. There's so many young people at the very bottom of the hierarchy, and there's very, very few people at the very top. And it tends to stay that way. There's only a few that actually make the way up and progress through drug supply in that hierarchy. And again, that's because of social capital or respect or competence.
So the young people often just used for a period of time and then ditched?
Yeah, they can be. Or they can just be used for different criminal activities. They tend not to be able to get out of that cycle, young people. I've not come across anybody in my research that has managed to come out the other side. The only young person that did was in prison. So he'd had a lot of time to reflect on what he was involved in and the exploitation he was subject to. But in general, for example, this was going back 2016, 2017 that I was doing this research. And I met with one of the young people the other day that was involved that I'd got quite a good relationship with. And again, about 2 weeks ago, he was caught by police on a county line in a different area. So it becomes very difficult because of that money that they make, and it's fast money, and because they haven't got any qualifications, it becomes very, very difficult for them to get out of that.
That was going to be my last question, actually. You just mentioned being caught, being imprisoned. Surely for a lot of them, this is where it ends.
Yeah. One of the young people said, you either end up in prison or you end up dead. And that is the real sad reality of it, I think, because we, as a society, we haven't got the resources to help young people out of exploitation. We've now got the national referral mechanism, but there's nothing in place to help that young person get out of that lifestyle. Yeah. Once they've been victimised or once they're involved in gangs, those people that they associate with have got a lot more pull than someone in the youth offending team who sits with that young person for an hour a week. And I feel like it's only going to get worse as well because of the increase in unemployment we're going to have after the pandemic. Opportunities were already not there for these young people, and there's going to be even less in the future.
And I have to ask, what about the employers themselves, the people at the top? Do they ever get caught, or is this the whole point that they're using county lines to not get caught?
They do, and they're increasingly being caught because police are becoming more aware of it. And I don't know if you heard, about 2 weeks ago, the National Crime Agency were working with Europol and different countries, and they've managed to arrest about 700 individuals who are really high up in criminality and drug supply. So they are, but usually the young people tend to be the ones that get caught the most.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that have got the drugs on them, or they're the ones that are in that area, and it's very, very difficult to then associate them with this drug dealer at the very top.
Yeah, that's always the perception we get from the outside of how it works. The people at the bottom are the ones that get the blame. And thank you very much, Grace. Could I ask you to give the listeners some of your details? I know you're on Twitter.
Yeah, of course. My Twitter handle is at Dr. Grace Robinson. And the website for Black Box Research and Consultancy is www.blackboxresearchandconsultancy.com.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time today, Grace. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes, and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.